She was 8 months pregnant, alone, and the man who destroyed her was finally on his knees in the rain. Damien Vescari, a name that made grown men flinch and governments look the other way, stood outside a small coastal clinic with nothing but a black coat and a face carved hollow by guilt. He didn't come with lawyers, didn't come with bodyguards. He came with 2 words: "I'm sorry," but Elena Marlowe had already buried the woman who needed to hear them. Before we go further, if stories about love, betrayal, and the price of power move you, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it hits you somewhere deep, give it a like. Now let's go back to where it all began, because the ending only makes sense if you understand just how completely he broke her. The night Damien Vescari signed the divorce papers, it was raining, not the romantic kind of rain that softens edges and blurs regrets. It was the angry kind, cold, relentless, the kind that soaks through wool coats and reminds you that the world owes you nothing. The kind of rain that drowns sound, so that when Elena said, "Damien, please just listen to me," her voice barely made it across the width of the study that had once been their shared sanctuary. He didn't look up from the desk. That was the part Elena would carry longest. Not the accusation, not the humiliation of being called a traitor in front of the men who worked for her husband, not even the sound of her mother-in-law's satisfied exhale from across the room. It was the fact that Damien Vescari, who had once pulled her out of a burning car with his bare hands and held her face like it was something irreplaceable, couldn't bring himself to look at her while he ended their marriage. His pen moved across the bottom of the page. Clean, decisive, final. "Get her out," he said to no one in particular, and 2 of his men materialized from the hallway like ghosts in expensive suits. Elena didn't fight them. She had learned in 4 years of marriage to this man that there were moments when fighting only gave the audience what they wanted. She straightened her spine, picked up the small overnight bag she'd brought with her. She hadn't even known she was going to need it when she walked in tonight, and walked out through the front door of the Vescari estate without looking back. She made it to the end of the driveway before her legs stopped cooperating. She sat on the wet stone curb in the rain, in her silk dress, and breathed, just breathed, in and out until her hands stopped shaking, until the sound of her own heartbeat stopped feeling like something collapsing. She didn't cry. She told herself she wouldn't. She almost kept that promise. What Elena did not tell anyone, what she pressed into the locked place behind her sternum and refused to let escape, was that she was 6 weeks pregnant. She had found out 3 days ago. She had been planning the right moment to tell Damien, had been thinking about how his face might change when she showed him the test, whether he would be afraid first or glad first, whether some part of that hard armor he wore might finally crack open into something soft. She never got the chance. Instead, Marco Ferretti, Damien's consigliere, a man with a thin smile and a mathematician's talent for manipulation, had spent 3 weeks quietly assembling a false narrative. Fabricated wire transfers, doctored photographs, a forged correspondence chain that placed Elena's name beside a rival family's financial accounts. He had packaged betrayal so cleanly that even Elena, presented with the evidence, had gone cold and speechless. Not because she was guilty, because the forgery was so precise, so intimate in its details. Dates that matched real meetings, locations only insiders knew, that for one terrible second, she'd felt the urge to question her own memories. And Damien's mother, Vittoria Vescari, had been waiting in the wings like a stage director who'd hired the actors herself. Vittoria had never approved of Elena. Not because Elena was weak. In fact, Vittoria was almost admiringly honest with her in private. "You're the strongest woman my son has ever chosen." It was precisely because Elena was strong that Vittoria feared her. Strong women asked questions. Strong women built loyalties that didn't run through the family bloodline. Strong women eventually became the gravitational center of a man's world, and Vittoria Vescari had not clawed her way through decades of blood and silence to become a satellite in someone else's orbit. So Vittoria had co-signed Marco's lie with the full weight of maternal authority. She had sat across from Damien with evidence spread on the conference table and said, in a voice like cold marble, "Your sentimentality is a liability. This is what love costs you when you let it compromise your judgment." And Damien, brilliant, brutal, terrifyingly capable Damien had believed it. Not because he was stupid, because he was proud. Because the alternative was admitting that someone he loved had seen all the dark machinery of him and chosen every morning to stay. And he had never fully trusted that. He had never trusted that he was the kind of man someone stayed for, rather than someone they stayed with out of calculation. The lie had fit too perfectly into the gap where his self-worth should have been. Elena sat on the curb for 20 minutes. Then she stood up, called a cab, and started making plans. She had a little money of her own. Not much. She'd been careful not to become financially absorbed into the Vescari structure, one of the quiet instincts that had protected her, and she used it to get herself to a bus station before dawn. By the time Damien's men would have thought to look for her, if they even bothered, she was already 3 states away. She found the coastal town almost by accident. The bus had mechanical trouble just outside the town limits, and while waiting for a replacement vehicle, Elena had walked into a small diner and ordered coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich. And the woman behind the counter, 50s, tired eyes, genuine smile, had brought her extra pickles without being asked and said, "You look like you could use a minute, honey." Elena had sat in that diner for 4 hours. The town was called Mercy Cove. She told herself it was only temporary. It wasn't. She found a small apartment above a hardware store with a view of the water. She found work helping at the local library cataloging a donated collection. She registered under a middle name and her maternal grandmother's surname. Nothing exotic, nothing that required clever forgery, just the ordinary erasure of a woman who'd decided to become someone the world hadn't cataloged yet. She found Dr. Nathan Holloway when she finally had to confront what she was carrying. She'd pushed the pregnancy deep into the back of her mind during the first weeks of running. Not because she didn't want the child, but because every time she let herself feel the reality of it, the enormity threatened to pull her under in a way that running couldn't survive. She needed to be functional first. She needed walls and income and a mailbox with a name on it before she could afford to feel. Nathan Holloway had a small practice at the edge of town, retired from hospital medicine, kept a modest clinic 2 mornings a week, because, as he told Elena during her first appointment, the nearest OB is 40 minutes away, and I've delivered more babies than I can count, so I figure I'm still useful. He was in his late 60s, methodical and unhurried, with the careful hands of someone who'd spent decades navigating human fragility without flinching. He never asked Elena about the baby's father. She almost wept with relief. His daughter Grace ran the administrative side of the clinic on an informal basis, scheduling, billing, the kind of unglamorous work that kept a small operation alive. Grace was in her mid-30s, a widow, raising a 6-year-old boy named Thomas, who had inherited his grandfather's unhurried temperament and his own unique talent for attaching himself to anyone who sat still long enough. Thomas decided he liked Elena on the second visit. He climbed up beside her in the waiting room chair, examined her with the frank gaze of someone who hasn't yet learned to pretend indifference, and said, "Your stomach is really big." "I know," Elena said. "Is there a baby in there?" "There is." "What's her name?" Elena looked at him. "I don't know yet." Thomas thought about this with tremendous seriousness. "I think you should name her something nice," he offered, and went back to his book. That was how it started. By the 3rd month, Elena was having dinner with Nathan and Grace twice a week. By the 5th month, Thomas had begun calling her Aunt Ellie with the absolute authority of a child who has decided something is true. By the 7th month, Grace had quietly moved a spare key under Elena's mat without comment, and Elena had accepted it without one. It was nothing dramatic. It was just people. Decent, ordinary people who asked nothing from her that she wasn't willing to give, and gave back more than they were owed. Elena had never had that. She had grown up careful, in a middle-class family that loved her but whose love came structured, conditional not in cruelty but in expectation. Then she'd married Damien and walked into a world where every kindness was either currency or strategy, where being loved by the most powerful man in the room meant being perpetually exposed to everyone who wanted to get to him through her. The people of Mercy Cove didn't know who she'd been. They only knew who she was now, a quiet woman with a rounding belly who worked at the library and made a very good lemon tart, and sometimes sat at the end of the municipal pier at sunset watching the water like she was looking for something she'd lost overboard. She was 7.5 months along when the black SUV appeared. She saw it before she heard it, just a shape in her peripheral vision, too clean for this town, the kind of vehicle that existed to signal power rather than serve it. She was walking back from the pier, her coat unbuttoned because nothing buttoned over her anymore, and she felt the particular stillness that comes when something wrong has entered the frame. She didn't run. She considered it, with the part of her mind that had been trained, not by Damien, but by 4 years of living inside his world, to assess exits and distances. She considered it and then decided against it, because running told you things about yourself that were hard to unknow, and because she was 8 months pregnant and her center of gravity was no longer reliable, and because, if she was being honest, there was a part of her that had been waiting for this, not hoping for it, waiting for it, the way you wait for a tooth that's been loose for too long to finally come out. She heard the car door. She heard his shoes on the wet pavement. She would recognize his footfall anywhere, even now, even after everything, the specific weight and rhythm of a man who had never learned to move quietly because he'd never needed to. She heard him stop a few feet behind her. She didn't turn around. "Elena." His voice was different. That was the first thing she registered. She had cataloged Damien Vescari's voice across every register she'd ever heard it occupy. The command voice that bent rooms to his will, the low private voice he saved for her alone, the cold voice that meant someone was about to be very sorry. She had never heard this version. This was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't muscle his way across. "Elena, please." She turned around slowly because she refused to give him the performance of a dramatic pivot. He looked terrible. That was the second thing. Damien Vescari, who wore bespoke suits and controlled his public image with the discipline of a man who understood that appearance was infrastructure, looked like he had slept in his car and shaved in a service station bathroom. There was a shadow under his jaw that wasn't stylish stubble, just neglect. His eyes. And this was what hit her somewhere she'd been carefully protecting. His eyes were carrying something she had never seen in them before in 4 years of marriage. Genuine shame. Not guilt. Not regret. Not the sophisticated kind of remorse that comes with a prepared exit strategy attached. Shame. The kind that had no moves left. The kind that just sat there in a person's face and said, "I know exactly what I did, and I know I cannot fix it. And I showed up anyway because staying away felt like cowardice." "Please," he said again, and his voice cracked on the single syllable, and Elena had to actively choose not to feel the sound of it. "Give me one more chance." She looked at him for a long time. The wind off the water moved between them. She thought about the divorce papers. She thought about the rain. She thought about sitting on that stone curb with her hands shaking and her secret pressed into her chest and not one single person in that driveway offering her a coat. She thought about Thomas saying, "I think you should name her something nice." She thought about the 8 months she'd spent becoming someone who didn't need Damien Vescari to validate her own heartbeat. "You're too late," she said. The words came out quiet. Not angry, not cruel. Just accurate, the way a diagnosis is accurate. She watched his face absorb them. And then she turned back toward the town, toward the light she recognized, toward the streets where people knew her name and didn't use it like a leash. What Elena didn't see, as she walked away, was what Damien did after. He didn't get back in the car. He stood in the middle of that empty coastal road in the dark, alone for the first time in longer than he could remember, without a bodyguard or a consigliere or his mother's voice in his ear, and he stood there until the cold worked all the way into his bones. Then he got his phone out and called his driver. "Find me a motel," he said. "Something cheap, close." "Sir, the nearest 4-star is 40 minutes. "I didn't ask for 4 stars. He hung up. He looked out at the dark water. He thought about a woman who had walked out of a document signing in the rain with her back straight and her jaw set and not one word of begging, not one. And he understood for the first time with absolute clarity that the bravest thing Elena Marlowe had ever done wasn't surviving the world he'd dragged her into. It was surviving him. He was still standing on that road when his phone buzzed with an address. $42 a night, one bed, a parking lot view. He took it. He had nowhere else to go, and for reasons he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't already stopped listening, leaving this town felt like a door closing on the last version of himself that still had a reason to be better than what he was. He wasn't ready for that door to close. What Damien didn't know, what he would not discover until 3 days later, when he was nursing black coffee in the diner, and the woman with the tired eyes and genuine smile let something slip about that nice Elena and her situation with the clinic, and what a shame they don't have the right equipment, was that the clinic where Elena was receiving her prenatal care had been operating without a working fetal heart monitor for 6 months, and that 2 weeks ago there had been a scare. A serious one. A night when Nathan Holloway had sat in that clinic with limited equipment and a pregnant woman whose blood pressure had spiked and whose hands wouldn't stop shaking, and had done everything he could with what he had while silently praying the ambulance from the city made it in time. It had. Barely. Damien sat in the diner parking lot for a long time after he heard that. Then he made a call. Not to his mother, not to Marco, who was no longer available for calls, not to anyone in the organization. He called a medical supply contact he'd used years ago for a hospital donation his public relations team had arranged for optics, and he said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very specific, "I need a list of equipment. Maternal care. Best available. I need it delivered to an address I'm going to give you, anonymously. No paperwork trail back to me. You understand what I mean by that?" "Of course, Mr. Viscari." "And I need it done in 72 hours. He hung up. He sat in the parking lot and looked at the diner lights. He wasn't doing it to win her back. He'd lost the right to that kind of transaction the night he'd signed his name at the bottom of a page without looking at her face. He was doing it because somewhere in the fundamental accounting of what he owed the world, this was one small payment on a debt so large it probably couldn't be settled in a single lifetime. And because 2 weeks ago, in a clinic that didn't have the right equipment, his child had nearly been lost. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't known. He hadn't been there. He thought about Elena, sitting in that clinic alone, blood pressure climbing, no husband, no family, just a retired doctor and the fierce, ordinary kindness of strangers. And something in the center of Damien Viscari's chest did something it had never done before in 41 years of a life lived at the edge of violence. It broke. Not dramatically, not with sound, just quietly, like the first crack in ice when the season changes. He started the car. He had 72 hours to arrange the delivery. He had no plan beyond that. He had no idea whether Elena would find out it was him. He suspected she probably would, eventually. She had always been 2 steps ahead of the narrative, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it didn't change anything. He wasn't doing it for credit. He wasn't doing it to be caught being good. He was doing it because it was the right thing, and because somewhere between signing divorce papers and standing on a wet road watching her walk away from him, he had finally understood that doing the right thing and winning were not the same transaction, and he had spent his entire life believing they were. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew, safe in the fragile, ordinary peace of Mercy Cove, was that 300 miles away, in a glass office above a city that owed Damien Viscari a great many favors, a man in a gray suit was opening a file with Elena's photograph in it. The file had been compiled by people who believed Elena knew things that could bury an empire, and they had just found out where she was living. The equipment arrived on a Tuesday. Nathan Holloway was in the middle of his morning coffee when the delivery truck pulled up outside the clinic. Not the beaten postal van that usually brought supplies, but a serious vehicle, unmarked, operated by 2 men in neutral gray uniforms who carried themselves with the contained efficiency of people paid very well to ask no questions. They unloaded 4 crates, a fetal monitoring system, an emergency obstetric kit, fully stocked, a portable ultrasound unit that cost more than the clinic's entire annual operating budget, and a blood pressure monitoring station that Nathan had once seen demoed at a medical conference in Boston and then quietly set aside in the section of his mind labeled things I will never be able to afford. There was no invoice, no return address, no card. Nathan stood in the doorway of his clinic with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at the equipment for a long time. Then he looked down the main street of Mercy Cove, as though the answer might be standing somewhere nearby in plain sight. It wasn't, or rather it was, but Nathan didn't know that yet. Grace found him still standing there 20 minutes later. She took one look at the crates, then one look at her father's face, and said, "Should I be worried?" "Probably not," Nathan said. "But I don't think this was random." Grace was quiet for a moment. She was good at reading the weight of silences. Her late husband had been a man of few words, too, and she had learned in 11 years of marriage how much information lived in the gap between what was said and what wasn't. "Elena," she said. It wasn't a question. "Something adjacent to Elena," Nathan said. Neither of them said anything else about it for the rest of the day. Elena found out that evening. She had stopped by the clinic to return a cardigan she'd borrowed from Grace, and Grace met her at the door with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation and has decided rehearsal is not going to help. She told her about the delivery. Matter of fact, watching Elena's face the way you watch a thermometer when you're not sure how high it's going to go. Elena's expression didn't change. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed most things now, with a stillness that people who didn't know her mistook for calm. Grace knew her well enough to know it wasn't calm. It was the specific kind of controlled that takes enormous effort to maintain. "Did you tell anyone?" Elena asked. "Just Dad." "Okay." Elena handed over the cardigan. "Thank you for telling me." "Elena, I'm fine." She smiled, and it was real enough, the smile, just not big enough to reach whatever was happening behind her eyes. "It doesn't change anything." She walked home along the waterfront because she always walked home along the waterfront in the evenings, because the sound of water was one of the few things that reliably organized the noise inside her head into something manageable. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her chin down, and she thought about Damien. She thought about him with the disciplined focus of someone performing an assessment, not an emotion. He was here. He'd been here for at least 72 hours, which meant he'd arranged the delivery from Mercy Cove, which meant he hadn't left after she'd told him he was too late, which she'd expected. Damien Viscari had never once in his life walked away from something he'd decided to pursue. It was one of the things that had made him extraordinary, and one of the things that had made him dangerous. And right now, it was the thing that made her stop at the end of the pier and press her palms flat on the railing and breathe carefully through the complicated feeling of being known that thoroughly by someone who had also hurt you that completely. She heard his footsteps. She didn't turn around. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't thank me," she said. "Don't make it about that. Don't use the clinic as an opening." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking about it." A pause. "Yes," he admitted. Old habit. She turned then, because she needed to see his face when she said what came next. He was standing about 10 feet back, hands in his coat pockets, jaw tight. He'd shaved. He was still staying somewhere cheap. She could tell by the way his suit didn't fit the way Damien's suits always fit, which meant he was managing his wardrobe from a single bag, which meant he'd been serious about not leaving. That landed somewhere she wasn't going to examine. "You want to know something honest?" she said. "Yes." "I'm not angry at you anymore." He looked at her. "I want you to understand that clearly," she said. "I'm not angry. I'm not waiting to be angry. I'm not managing anger to look composed. I genuinely, actually stopped being angry somewhere around the 4th month, because I realized that being angry at you required maintaining a relationship with you, and I didn't want one anymore, not even a hostile one. You understand the difference?" His jaw moved. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I understand the difference. The equipment was the right thing. I know why you did it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to refuse it because it came from you, because that would be using my pride as a weapon against my own child. And I won't do that. Elena? I'm not finished." She held eye contact. "Don't mistake my fairness for softness. The equipment doesn't open a door. It's not a deposit on anything. You did a good thing. That's what it is. That's all it is." Something moved across his face. It wasn't argument. It was closer to something accepting a blow it had braced for. "Okay," he said. "Why are you still here, Damien?" He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air off the water. "Because going back to what I came from requires believing that's all I am, and I'm not ready to believe that. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She hated a little bit that it was. Don't get close to the Holloways, she said finally, turning back toward the water. They're good people. They don't need to get pulled into whatever you're carrying. She felt him absorb that. All right, he said. She heard him leave. She stood at the railing for another 20 minutes after the sound of his footsteps had gone, one hand resting on the hard curve of her stomach, the other gripping the wood until her knuckles ached. The baby moved, a slow, deliberate roll, the kind of movement that had started to feel like punctuation at the end of long days. I know, Elena said, to no one, to her. To this small, contained life that had survived everything its parents had managed to inflict on the world before it arrived. I know. She didn't sleep well that night. Damien didn't sleep at all. He sat at the small table in his motel room with a laptop and a phone and worked through the night doing the thing he'd been doing for weeks in between searching for Elena. Methodically, surgically dismantling the financial architecture of the criminal network he'd spent 15 years building. Not out of nobility, out of the particular exhaustion of a man who has run a very long and very costly con on himself and finally sees the ledger clearly. He'd started the dissolution 2 days after he found Elena, not before. Before, he'd been too busy using it as justification to delay confrontation with the truth. But after standing in that coastal road watching her walk away with her coat open and her back straight and not one syllable of need in her voice, he'd gone back to his motel room and called the only lawyer he trusted with something other than criminal defense and said, I'm going to need you for something complicated. How complicated? Biblical. The lawyer had been quiet for a long time. Okay, he'd said finally. The process was slow, deliberate, and expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. Damien had signed things over, called in arrangements, quietly contacted federal contacts he'd accumulated over years as insurance policies he'd hoped never to need. He was careful not to move fast enough to look like a man running ahead of an indictment, which he wasn't quite, though it was close. He was moving like a man paying off a debt that didn't have a due date, but had been overdue for a long time. He didn't tell Elena any of this. He wasn't doing it to tell her. He was doing it because his daughter, a word that was still so new in his mind it felt like a foreign language, his daughter, was going to be born into a world that he would no longer be actively making worse. That seemed like the minimum viable start. He was on his third cup of coffee when his phone rang at 4 a.m. The contact number was one he hadn't seen in 8 months. His chest tightened before he even answered. Salvatore, he said, you need to know something. Salvatore Miren had been Damien's intelligence source for a decade. Not a loyalist, not an associate, a paid professional with a specific and valuable skill set and no emotional investment in any outcome except being paid. When Salvatore called at 4 a.m., there was no version of the next sentence that was good news. The Caltieri faction survived. Damien set down his coffee cup. All of them. Enough of them. The ones who weren't in the building when you took Ferretti down. There's a woman running them now. Nadia Caltieri, Marcus's youngest. Sharp, patient. She's been quiet for 4 months doing exactly what you'd do if you were her. Rebuilding. Rebuilding, consolidating, and most importantly, going through Marcus's files looking for anything that puts her in a position to offset what she lost when you dismantled the network. A beat. She found a file on Elena. The room went very still. What kind of file? Damien said. His voice had changed, not raised, lowered. The people who'd worked for him long enough knew that particular register well, and none of them enjoyed hearing it. Marcus kept records. Your organization's financial backbone. The offshore routing, the layer accounts, the real ownership chain on 11 legitimate businesses used for laundering. Elena was present for 3 meetings where sensitive documentation was discussed. Marcus noted it. Nadia believes Elena either memorized or photographed those records. Elena didn't do that. I know she didn't. Nadia doesn't care whether she actually did. What matters is whether those records exist and where they are, and Elena is the only loose thread Nadia can pull on. She's already sent 2 people to locate her. Damien was already on his feet. When? 2 days ago. Where are they now? That's why I'm calling at 4 a.m. Another beat, shorter this time, the kind of pause that meant the information on the other side was very bad. I lost the trace on them 6 hours ago. Which means they're either very good at covering movement or they're already close to where they're going. Damien ended the call. He was dressed and moving in under 90 seconds. The motel door opened onto the empty parking lot, cold and quiet. The town's main street visible at the far end in the orange half-light of pre-dawn. He stood there for 3 seconds doing the thing his brain did involuntarily in threat situations. Mapping, calculating, identifying. The particular hyperclarity that had kept him alive through things that should have killed him. He knew this town now. He'd spent 2 weeks walking it quietly, not intrusively, learning its layout and routines with the same patience he'd brought to every operation that mattered. One road in and one road out along the coast, a back route through the hills that connected to the regional highway, the clinic at the north end of town, the library where Elena worked, the pier, the hardware store with the apartment above it. He started moving, not running. Running in a parking lot at 4 in the morning drew attention and created memory. He walked fast, phone out, already calling the only local resource he'd been quietly maintaining since he'd arrived. A former associate now living legitimately, whose presence in the county was coincidental, and whose debt to Damien was old enough to have ripened into genuine obligation. "I need eyes on an address," Damien said when the line connected. "Right now, no action, just eyes. Call me the second you see anything that doesn't belong." He gave the address of Elena's apartment. Then he walked to a spot 2 blocks south with a sightline to her building and waited with his back to a wall and his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the upper windows where Elena's light was off, the way it should be at 4 in the morning, the way it meant she was still asleep and unaware and unreachable in the best possible way. His phone buzzed at 4:47. Dark SUV, parked past the hardware store. 2 occupants. Neither one is local. Damien's arm tightened on the phone. He moved. He came around the back of the hardware store through the service alley, the kind of approach that relied on knowing exactly where the ambient light died, and the shadows owned the geometry of the space. He came up beside the SUV from the rear quarter, angled too tight for the mirrors, and put his palm flat on the driver's door before either occupant had finished processing that someone was standing there. The driver's window was cracked for airflow. Damien spoke through it in a voice so quiet and so specifically calibrated that it carried the exact weight of someone who is not performing a threat, but stating a fact. "You're in the wrong town." The driver, young, trained, not quite trained enough, went for something inside his jacket. Damien's hand was already through the window. What followed was brief and very efficient, and left the driver folded sideways over the center console with his wrist at an angle that made further reaching impossible. The passenger had opened his door and cleared the vehicle before Damien could cover the distance. But he'd been in a hurry, which meant he'd made errors. And a man in a hurry who makes errors in close quarters with Damien Viscari has a very short window of relevance. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. Damien stood in the alley afterward, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way you do when your body wants to keep running hot and you need it to think instead. His knuckles were split on the right hand. There was a line of pain along his left ribs where he'd caught an elbow he hadn't fully slipped. He cataloged these things automatically and set them aside. He looked at the 2 men on the ground. He recognized the work, not the men. They were soldiers, interchangeable, the kind of resource any competently run organization could acquire. But the approach pattern, the vehicle registration he'd memorized through the window, the particular model of encrypted phone he'd taken off the passenger, all of it pointed in the same direction. Nadia Caltieri. He stood in the alley with the cold settling into his split knuckles and thought about what came next with the part of his mind that he'd hoped, genuinely, seriously hoped, to never need again. The part that didn't ask, how do we avoid this, but instead asked, how do we end this with maximum certainty and minimum collateral exposure? He'd been wrong. He'd thought dissolving the empire was enough. He'd thought the careful dismantling, the federal cooperation, the quiet accounting would create enough distance that the residual threats would have no reason to reach in Elena's direction. He'd underestimated Nadia Caltieri's intelligence and overestimated his own ability to separate his past from the people it now endangered. He took out his phone and called Salvatore. She already sent them. I know, Salvatore said. I was going to call you. These two are handled. Who else does she have moving? Silence. Salvatore. I don't know, Salvatore said, and it was the worst possible answer, because Salvatore always knew. Not knowing meant Nadia had sources that Salvatore's network hadn't mapped yet, which meant she was further along than either of them had assessed. She's been building something quiet for months. I've got fragments. It's enough to know it's serious. Tell me about Holloway, Damien said. Another silence, and this one had a different texture, the kind that preceded information that reorganized the shape of a problem. She knows about the Holloways, Salvatore said. She knows Elena is close to them. She knows the old man runs a clinic. Damien's eyes closed for 1 second. She's going to use them. It wasn't a question. It was the recognition of a tactical pattern he'd have used himself, once, in a different life. You don't always go directly at the thing you want. Sometimes you take what's beside it and let the thing come to you. Probably, Salvatore said. The old man and the woman are visible, accessible, and they clearly matter to Elena. If Nadia wants to create leverage, when? I can't give you a window. Could be days. Could be tonight. Damien looked at the two men on the ground. Sending them back was not an option. They couldn't stay in this alley indefinitely. He needed to move quickly and quietly in a small town where he'd been conspicuous enough already, with a woman who'd explicitly told him not to get close to the people he now needed to protect. He thought about Elena's face on the pier. Don't get close to the Holloways. They're good people. He thought about Nathan Holloway, a retired doctor who ran a small clinic on the edge of a coastal town because he figured he was still useful, who had delivered meals to a pregnant woman running from her life and never once asked her to explain herself. He thought about Thomas, who had climbed up beside Elena in a waiting room and said, I think you should name her something nice. Damien Vescari made a decision. It was not the decision of the man he'd been trying to stop being. It was the decision of the man he had not yet finished becoming, and the distance between those two people was still wide enough to be uncomfortable but narrow enough, finally, to cross. He made 3 calls in rapid succession: coordinates, resources, protocols. The language of a world he'd been trying to leave, spoken one final time with the specific authority of someone who built that world from the ground up and knew exactly which levers moved which walls. Then he walked to Nathan Holloway's house and knocked on the door at 5:15 in the morning. Nathan opened it in a robe, unhurried, taking in Damien's split knuckles and the set of his jaw with the same diagnostic steadiness he brought to everything. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked. You're him, Nathan said finally. Not an accusation, just a fact being placed on the table between them. Yes, Damien said. Are my daughter and my grandson in danger? Potentially. I'm working to make sure they're not. But I need you to trust me for the next 24 hours, and I need you to not tell Elena what I'm about to ask you to do. Nathan studied him the way men of his generation studied things, fully, without performance, taking the time the moment actually required. He looked at the split knuckles. He looked at the line of something deeply tired in Damien's eyes, the particular exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from a long sequence of choices finally coming due. You love her, Nathan said. I lost the right to call it that. That's not what I asked. Damien held eye contact. Yes. Nathan was quiet for another long moment. Then he opened the door wider. Come inside, he said. Tell me what you need. It was at that precise moment, Damien stepping across the threshold of Nathan Holloway's small, warm house, with its smell of old books and someone else's ordinary life, that 300 miles away, in an office above a city that owed nobody anything, Nadia Caltieri opened a folder on her desk and picked up a phone and gave an order that would reach Mercy Cove before morning was fully light. An order that would make everything that came next not a question of whether the violence arrived, but only of who was standing between it and the people it was aimed at when it did. Nathan Holloway made coffee. It was such a specific and ordinary thing to do at 5:15 in the morning with a man who had split knuckles and violence still sitting in the set of his shoulders, But Nathan moved to the kitchen with the unhurried competence of someone who had learned long ago that the body needed something to do while the mind processed the weight of what it was being asked to carry. He filled the kettle. He set out 2 mugs. He didn't ask Damien how he took it. He just made it black and strong and put it on the table and sat down across from him with his own cup and waited. Damien looked at the coffee for a moment. Then he talked. He didn't give Nathan the full architecture. He gave him what Nathan needed: the essential shape of the danger, the specific nature of the people moving toward Mercy Cove, the realistic timeline, and what Damien needed from him in the next 24 hours. He spoke without euphemism and without the careful omissions he'd trained himself to use with civilians. Nathan was not a man who needed to be protected from clarity. Damien could tell that from the way he listened, still, attentive, absorbing information without flinching, asking precise questions only when he needed to, never when he was simply uncomfortable. "Grace and Thomas," Damien said, "I need them somewhere else today. Not a long trip, not something that looks like evacuation. A reason they'd naturally leave town for a day. An errand, a visit, something Grace would choose on her own." "Grace's sister lives in Hartwell," Nathan said, 2 hours north. "Thomas has been asking to go for weeks." "Can you call her tonight? Make it feel natural?" "Grace is going to ask questions. Tell her you need some time alone to think. She'll believe that. She worries about you." Nathan looked at him steadily. "You've been watching us. Long enough to know your daughter loves you and your grandson loves Elena, and neither of them deserves to be in the middle of what's coming." Damien held eye contact. "I know what I am. I'm not asking you to think well of me. I'm asking you to get them out." Nathan wrapped both hands around his mug. "And Elena. Elena is the problem. She won't leave. No. She'll figure out something is wrong the moment Grace drives away with Thomas." "Yes." "So what do you tell her?" Damien looked down at his coffee. "Nothing, yet. I need 12 hours. 12 hours to position people and close off the approach routes before this escalates into something I can't contain quietly." He paused. "After that, I'll tell her everything." Nathan was quiet for a moment. In the other room, the house ticked and settled the way old houses do in the early morning, the particular sounds of a structure that has absorbed decades of ordinary life and holds it in its walls. "You know she's going to be angry," Nathan said. "Yes." "Not about the danger, about you making decisions around her again." "I know." "That's the thing that broke her the first time, someone deciding what she needed to know and when she needed to know it." Damien looked up. Nathan was watching him with an expression that wasn't unkind but wasn't soft either. It was the look of a man laying a fact on the table and waiting to see if the person across from him had the capacity to actually receive it. "I know," Damien said again, and this time the word had a different weight. Not defensive, just honest. Nathan studied him a moment longer. Then he nodded once, picked up his phone, and called his daughter. Damien sat in Nathan's kitchen and listened to one half of a conversation engineered to sound completely ordinary, and thought about what kind of man asks a retired doctor to lie to his daughter at 5 in the morning, and thought about the answer to that question, and found it uncomfortable in a way that was probably useful. Grace bought it. She was on the road with Thomas by 7:30. Damien was back on the street by 6, his 3 called-in resources now moving into position. Men he trusted not because they were loyal in the romantic sense, but because their interests aligned precisely with his, and because he had enough history with each of them to know the specific texture of their reliability. They were not friends, they were professionals. In this context, professionals were what the situation required. He walked the town in the early morning light, mapping his own previous map against the new information, looking for the variables that had shifted. The 2 men from the SUV were no longer his immediate problem. He'd made arrangements for that in the alley, the kind of arrangements that cost money and left no paperwork. Nadia's next move was the variable. She was patient and she was smart, and she'd waited 4 months, which meant she was not going to move without a plan that had redundancies built in. He needed to think the way she was thinking. He found himself, without quite deciding to, standing outside the library. It wasn't open yet. The lights inside were off, but Elena arrived early. He knew that. She did it every morning, had done it every morning in the 3 weeks he'd been watching the rhythms of her life from a careful distance. She unlocked the side door at 7:52 and left it propped while she turned the lights on. He was inside before she'd cleared the entrance hall. She heard his footstep and went still, back to him, hand still on the light switch. A breath. Then she turned around. She took one look at his knuckles. "No," she said. "Elena, no." She crossed the space between them in 4 steps, moving faster than a woman 8 months pregnant had any business moving, and grabbed his wrist and turned his hand over to look at the damage in the light. Her jaw was tight. Her fingers were careful. "When?" "Last night." "How many?" "2." She looked up at him. Her eyes were doing the thing he remembered, that rapid, comprehensive assessment that most people mistook for anger, but was actually something closer to her version of the clarity he got in crisis situations. She was mapping, processing. 3 seconds of it, then, "They were here for me." "Yes." She released his wrist, stepped back, crossed her arms over her stomach. Not a defensive posture, just the habitual comfort of a woman in her 3rd trimester who had stopped having anywhere else comfortable to put her hands. "How bad is it?" "Manageable. I have people—" "How bad, Damien?" he told her. He'd decided in Nathan's kitchen that he would tell her everything, and he kept that decision, laying it out with the same directness he'd given Nathan, maybe more, because Elena deserved more, and he was done making calculations about what she could handle. She listened without interrupting. Her breathing stayed even, but her face moved through a sequence of things. A tightening around the eyes when he said Nadia's name, a controlled exhale when he described the approach pattern. A stillness so complete it was almost frightening when he told her about the file Marcus Caltieri had kept with her name on it. "He kept a file on me," she said flatly. "Yes." Ferretti's people and the Caltieri faction were connected. Apparently deeper than I knew. Something moved through her expression then. Not surprise, something older than surprise. The specific weariness of a person who has been told a story about their own life that they weren't present for and cannot revise. "So, everything that happened to us," she said slowly, "Ferretti, your mother, the divorce, it wasn't just internal." Damien felt the ground shift under the conversation. "What do you mean?" "I mean Marcus Caltieri had reason to want me gone. I mean, Ferretti had the Caltieri faction's resources behind him when he built that case against me. I mean—" She stopped, put her hand flat on the nearest bookshelf. Her knuckles went white. "I mean, maybe it wasn't just your mother and your consigliere. Maybe someone from outside was feeding them material, directing them." The silence in the library was very loud. Damien looked at her and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone whose professional life had been built on understanding networks of causation, exactly what she was saying and exactly why he hadn't seen it before. And the reason he hadn't seen it was that he'd spent 8 months understanding his own guilt as the central event of the story, rather than asking what had manufactured the conditions for his guilt to operate in. "Marcus Caltieri," he said, "wanted your empire destabilized. What better way than to take out the one person in it who had no enemies of her own, and make it look like she was the enemy?" The bookshelf creaked under her hand. "If I'd found that file 8 months ago," Damien said, and then stopped, because the end of that sentence led somewhere neither of them needed to go right now. "You didn't," Elena said. "So." She was protecting him from the hypothetical. He noticed that, stored it somewhere, and kept moving. "I need you to stay away from the clinic today. Nathan knows. I talked to him this morning." He watched her register that, a flicker of something, not quite hurt but adjacent to it, the old reflex of being managed. "I know," he said before she could say it. "I know. I should have come to you first. I needed Grace and Thomas on the road before they were exposed, and I needed to move fast. It was the wrong call, and I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know everything, including when I make decisions I shouldn't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Where's Nathan now?" "At the clinic. I have someone outside." "He won't like that." He accepted it. She nodded slowly. Her hand came off the shelf. She turned toward the library window and stood there looking out at the morning street where nothing was visibly wrong yet, where the hardware store was opening and 2 elderly men were having their habitual sidewalk conversation outside the bakery, and the world of Mercy Cove was performing its ordinary Tuesday self without any knowledge of what was moving toward it. "Okay," she said. Just that. Okay. Not agreement, not forgiveness, not the opening of a door, just the word of a woman who had looked at a situation and made a pragmatic decision about where her energy needed to go. Damien had seen her do it before. It was one of the things he'd loved about her, and one of the things he'd failed to deserve. He left her at the library. He had work to do. The work took 7 hours. It was not dramatic work externally. It was phone calls and positioning and the kind of careful logistical management that looks, to anyone watching, like a man making business arrangements. Damien moved through the town with the patience of someone who has learned that visible urgency is a liability, stopping for coffee at the diner, nodding to the hardware store owner who'd grown accustomed to seeing him, presenting a surface of someone who belonged here, while underneath he was pulling threads and closing gaps and managing a perimeter around a coastal town that didn't know it needed one. At 2 in the afternoon, he received a call from Salvatore. "She moved faster than I thought," Salvatore said. "I've got confirmation of a 4-man team. Different approach this time, not direct. They're going through the back route, the hill road." "How far out?" 2, maybe 3 hours, maybe. "They're going for the clinic," Damien said. It wasn't a question. He'd already worked through the logic. The hallways were the leverage point, and the clinic was the most isolatable location. "Nathan needs to close early." "Damien, there's something else." The way Salvatore said it, the specific cadence of it, the slight compression in the word else, made Damien stop walking. "What?" "The 4-man team isn't the primary move, it's the distraction." A beat. "I just got eyes on a second vehicle. Different plates, solo occupant, already in town." Everything in Damien's body went very still. "Already in town," he repeated. "Got here this morning, while you were at the old man's house. While he was at Nathan's house. While he was making coffee and laying out plans and sending Grace and Thomas north on a route that he had not checked for surveillance because he hadn't known there was already someone inside the perimeter. While he was being careful and methodical and thorough, Nadia Caltieri had already put someone inside the wire. "Where are they now?" Damien said. Salvatore gave him an address. Damien looked at the address on his screen. The hardware store, Elena's building. He was running before Salvatore finished the sentence. He covered 4 blocks in under 90 seconds, which was not something he'd done in several years, and which cost him in the specific way that 41-year-old knees register these decisions. But none of that was relevant. The hardware store's front door was open, the owner visible inside, nothing outwardly wrong. He went around back, took the service stairs 2 at a time, came up to Elena's landing. Her door was open. He went through it fast and low and came up with his back to the interior wall and his eyes moving. Kitchen, clear, living room clear, and then the bedroom doorway, and through it. Elena was sitting on the edge of her bed. Across from her, in the chair by the window, sat a woman. Late 30s, dark hair, well-dressed in the understated way of someone who spends money to look like they're not spending money. She had a phone on her knee and both hands visible, which was either genuine non-aggression or the most precise form of it, and she was watching Damien come through the door with an expression of complete composure. "Mr. Vescari," Nadia Caltieri said, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Elena's face was arranged in the particular controlled stillness that Damien now recognized as her fury in its most contained and therefore most dangerous form. She was not afraid. She was furious, and she was containing it because someone had come into her home while she was alone and 8 months pregnant, and she had made the calculation that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "She knocked," Elena said to Damien, her voice flat and precise. "She said she wanted to talk." "And do you feel like talking?" Damien said to Nadia. He hadn't moved from the doorway. "Very much." Nadia crossed her legs. Easy, unhurried, the posture of someone who believed she controlled the geometry of the room. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about what I want. My people this morning were a precaution. I don't want Elena hurt." A pause, calibrated. "I want the records." "There are no records," Elena said. "I believe you." Nadia said it without hesitation, which was the tell. the place where the manipulation was most visible to anyone looking for it. She'd said it too quickly, too smoothly. She didn't believe Elena at all. She'd simply decided that disagreeing was inefficient. But my organization has financial records that your late consigliere connected to your account structure, Mr. Viscari, and those records are currently in the possession of a federal task force that has been building a case for me. Stop, Damien said. Nadia stopped. What do you actually want? Damien said. Not the version designed to make you sound reasonable. Something shifted in Nadia's face, just slightly. The composure didn't crack. It was better than that. She'd built it from too durable a material. But it adjusted, recalibrated, and what came through was something closer to what was actually underneath. I want the federal case killed, she said. You have contacts. You've been cooperating anonymously for months. You can withdraw your cooperation. You can introduce specific corrupted data into their evidentiary chain. You can do it without exposing yourself and without it tracing back to me. And in exchange, no one in this town is touched. Not the doctor, not his daughter, not the child. Her eyes moved to Elena. Not her. The bedroom was very quiet. Outside the window, a gull called twice and went silent. Damien looked at Nadia Caltieri and understood with complete clarity that she was not bluffing. She had the patience and the intelligence to follow through on every consequence she was implying, and she had people in this town right now and more people inbound on the Hill Road, and the calculation she was presenting him with was real. Compromise the federal investigation he'd spent months building, or accept the consequences of refusing. I need a minute, Damien said. Of course. Nadia's composure settled back into its default position. Gracious, patient. The expression of someone who has already decided how this ends. Damien looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him. In her face, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear. Not the silent pleading of someone asking to be rescued. What he saw was the absolute refusal to be the reason he made a corrupt choice. It was in the set of her jaw and the quality of her stillness. The specific posture of a woman saying, "Don't you dare do this for me," without making a sound. He almost smiled. He didn't. He looked back at Nadia. Step outside. Nadia raised an eyebrow. I'm not going to do anything that requires you to use that phone, Damien said. I just need to speak with Elena alone. You can stand in the hallway and leave the door open. Nadia considered this for 3 seconds, then stood and moved to the doorway with the fluid economy of someone who has decided compliance is tactically sound. She positioned herself in the hall facing the room, phone held loosely. Damien crossed to Elena and crouched in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers. His voice dropped to the threshold of audibility. Listen to me. Don't, Elena said quietly. Don't tell me to be calm. I wasn't going to. He looked at her. I need you to trust me for about 45 seconds. She looked at him. Not the way I asked you to trust me before, he said. Not like that. I know I don't have that credit anymore. I mean, trust that I'm about to do something and I need you not to react to it until it's done. Can you give me that? She held his gaze for a long moment. The baby moved between them, that slow, unmistakable shifting weight, and he watched Elena's breath catch for a half second before she controlled it again. 45 seconds, she said. He stood up and turned around. He walked to the doorway where Nadia stood and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was the expression of a man who has genuinely stopped caring what this costs him personally and has therefore become something far more dangerous than someone who is afraid. No, he said. Nadia's composure held. Mr. Viscari. No, I'm not corrupting the federal case. I'm not withdrawing cooperation. I'm not introducing false data into an evidentiary chain that took 8 months to build. He held her gaze. And before you make your next move, there's something you need to understand. Nadia waited. The 4-man team on the Hill Road, Damien said, has been detained as of 11 minutes ago. The vehicle you arrived in is currently being documented by 2 individuals who work for a contact within the U.S. Marshal's office. Your presence in this building is being recorded from 3 separate angles by equipment I positioned in this town 2 weeks ago. He paused. And the file your father kept on Elena, the one that started all of this, has been in federal hands since 6 o'clock this morning. along with documentation connecting the Caltieri faction's financial infrastructure to Ferretti's operation against my organization, along with your name. Something moved through Nadia's face. Fast. A crack in the architecture. You've been building a case on me, she said. I've been building a case on everyone, Damien said, including myself. That's the only way it works. Nadia's hand tightened on the phone. If you use that phone right now, Damien said, you call someone who is no longer in a position to help you, and you add a conspiracy charge to everything else. He looked at her with something that was not quite pity, but was in that direction. Walk out. Go back to wherever you came from. Get a lawyer. A very good one. Nadia Caltieri stood in that hallway for 10 seconds. Then she walked out. Her footsteps were even on the stairs. The back door of the building opened and closed. Silence. Damien stood in the doorway of Elena's bedroom and breathed. Then Elena said, from the bed, her voice very controlled and very quiet, "Were any of that true?" He turned around. The recording equipment, the marshal's contact, the file, and the Hill Road team. Detained as of, he checked his watch, 13 minutes ago now. Elena looked at him. And the part where you said you were including yourself. The question sat between them. He met her eyes. Yes. She nodded slowly, once. Then she put her hand on her stomach and said, I need to sit here for a minute. And he understood she wasn't asking him to leave and wasn't asking him to stay, just telling him the true thing about where she was. And he sat down on the floor beside her bed with his back against the mattress and his split knuckles resting on his knees, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the most honest they had been with each other in 4 years, maybe ever. It lasted about 7 minutes, that quiet. Then Elena's breath changed. A sharp intake, controlled immediately, but not quite controlled enough. Damien went still. What? Nothing, Elena said, and her voice was completely steady except for the one word being slightly too fast. It's fine. Elena. I said... She stopped. She took a careful breath. Her hand on her stomach had changed position, moved to the lower left, pressing gently with the focused attention of someone locating something. It's probably nothing. Nathan, Damien said. It's probably... I'm calling Nathan. He was already on his feet, already dialing, and Elena didn't stop him, which told him everything he needed to know about how fine it actually was, because Elena Marlowe did not allow anyone to make calls on her behalf unless the alternative was worse. And right now the alternative must have been looking considerably worse, and the understanding of that landed in Damien's chest like something falling from a very great height as Nathan answered on the second ring, and Damien said, his voice doing the thing it did when he needed it to carry absolute authority without any noise in it at all. I need you at Elena's apartment right now. Bring what you need. She's having... Nathan arrived in 11 minutes. Not because 11 minutes was fast. It wasn't. It was 11 minutes too long. And Damien stood in the narrow hallway outside Elena's bedroom door for every second of it with his phone in his hand and his jaw locked, and the particular quality of helplessness that is specific to people who are very good at controlling things being confronted with something they cannot control at all. He could hear Elena breathing on the other side of the door, measured, deliberate, the sound of a woman applying enormous discipline to a body that was no longer fully cooperating with the application of discipline. He knocked twice. I'm here. I know you're here, she said. Her voice was even, tight at the edges, but even. You're pacing. I can hear you. He stopped pacing. Sit down, she said. You're making it worse. He sat down on the floor with his back against the hallway wall and his knees up and his hands loose between them and stared at the opposite wall and tried to remember how to breathe at a rate that wasn't going to require medical attention of its own. Nathan came up the stairs with his bag and took one look at Damien on the floor and said nothing, which was exactly the right response, and went through the bedroom door and closed it behind him. Damien sat in the hallway. 5 minutes. 10. The sounds from the bedroom were not alarming. Nathan's voice, low and steady. The specific register of a doctor who has learned that calmness is a clinical tool. Elena's voice, responding, shorter than Nathan's, a long quiet. Then Nathan again. At the 14-minute mark, Nathan opened the door. Damien was on his feet before the door had swung fully open. Nathan read his face with the efficiency of a man who has managed a great deal of panic in professional settings and said, "She's not in labor. Stress response. The blood pressure spiked, same as the incident 2 months ago, but she's coming down. She needs to rest for the next several hours and not be agitated." "Not be agitated," Damien repeated. "I know," Nathan said, without a trace of irony. "Do your best." He looked at Damien steadily. "She wants to see you." Damien went through the door. Elena was sitting up against the headboard with 2 pillows behind her and her hands folded on her stomach and her face carrying the particular exhausted composure of someone who has just won an argument with their own body and is not entirely sure the body has conceded the point. She looked at him when he came in. He stopped at the foot of the bed because he didn't know what permission he had beyond that point. "Sit," she said. He sat in the chair Nadia Caltieri had occupied 40 minutes ago, which he noticed and set aside. "I'm fine," Elena said. Nathan said, "I know what Nathan said. I'm fine." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "It's happened before. I know how to manage it." "It happened before because of me." "Yes." She didn't soften it, just confirmed it with the matter-of-fact directness she brought to most things. "And it almost happened again today because someone came into my home. That's not your fault." "My past walked into your home." "Yes. And you handled it." She looked at him. "That's not nothing, Damien." The room was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting, the particular angle of coastal late afternoon that turned everything gold and slightly unreal. Damien looked at Elena in that light and thought about how many times in the last 4 years he had looked at her without actually seeing her, the specific failure of vision that comes with taking presence for granted, and felt the familiar weight of that understanding settle further into him. "You need to sleep," he said. "I know. I'll be outside." "I know that too." She closed her eyes. Then, without opening them, "Damien." "Yeah." "Don't go far." He stood in the hallway outside her door for the next 2 hours while she slept, and Nathan sat in the kitchen downstairs, and the town outside went about its afternoon, and nobody came up the stairs, and the phone in his pocket stayed quiet, and it was the closest thing to peace that Damien Viscari had felt in longer than he could accurately calculate. Then his phone rang. It was Salvatore. "The Hill Road team wasn't detained," Salvatore said. Damien went still. "What?" "2 of my guys got there, found the location. No one there." A beat. The approach route had been used, fresh tire marks, cigarette butts. Someone had been there for a few hours. But they were gone before my people arrived. "Nadia warned them," Damien said. He was already moving down the stairs, already calculating. "When I let her walk out, she warned them." "That's what it looks like." "How long ago did they clear out?" "Best estimate, 40 minutes, maybe less." 40 minutes. He'd been sitting in Elena's bedroom having a human moment for 40 minutes while 4 trained people reorganized their approach. He hit the ground floor, caught Nathan's eye through the kitchen doorway, held up a hand that meant stay put, stay quiet, and went out the back of the building. "Where would she redirect them?" Damien said into the phone. "If the original play was leveraged through the holloways, Grace and Thomas are 2 hours north." "Then the clinic," Salvatore said, "or the old man directly." Damien looked toward the north end of town, where the clinic sat at the end of a quiet street with its freshly restocked supply room and its single part-time staff member who came in Tuesday afternoons, and its retired doctor who was currently sitting in Elena's kitchen, believing the immediate crisis had passed. How long would they need to set up in the clinic? If they moved from the Hill Road directly, they could be there now. Damien was already moving. He went back up the stairs, 2 at a time, silent. Opened Elena's bedroom door. She was asleep, genuinely asleep, her breathing deep and regular, and her face finally without the controlled tension it wore when she was awake. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he went down to the kitchen. "Nathan," he kept his voice level, "there's a possibility the clinic is compromised right now." Nathan set down his coffee mug very carefully. "My staff member, who closes up on Tuesdays. Carol, she's 63. Call her. Tell her there's a gas concern in the building. She needs to step outside and wait for the utility company. Don't tell her anything else. He held eye contact. Can you do that without sounding like something is wrong? Nathan picked up his phone and called Carol, and what he said was, Carol, I just got an alert from the building management company. Apparently a routine gas check came up with a flag. Could you step outside and just wait for the van? They said, 20 minutes. I'm sorry for the hassle. And his voice was so completely ordinary that even Damien, who knew exactly what was underneath it, could barely detect the effort. Carol stepped outside. Damien was out Nathan's back door before the call ended. He went around the eastern side of town, staying off the main street, moving through the residential back routes he'd memorized in the first week. The clinic was a low white building at the north end with a small parking area and a row of young trees along the front that provided coverage from the street. He came at it from the service road behind, putting the building between himself and any line of sight from the front windows. He saw the vehicle immediately. Dark green. Local plates, or plates that wanted to read as local. Parked at an angle in the service area that was technically correct but slightly too precise, the way someone parks when they're thinking about angles rather than convenience. He clocked it and kept moving. He went in through the service entrance. The building was quiet in the specific way that buildings are quiet when something has been done to make them quiet. The particular absence of ambient sound that indicates human presence managing itself very carefully. He moved through the supply corridor with his back to the wall and his weight on the balls of his feet, the way you move when you need to know what a floor is going to do before it announces you. 2 men in the main examination room. He saw them through the internal window before they saw him, one at the equipment station doing something to the new monitoring system, and one by the door to the front entrance, looking out at the street where Carol would have been standing, waiting for a utility van that was not coming. A third man he hadn't placed yet. He recalibrated. 3 against 1, unfamiliar internal geography, a town on the other side of those walls that could not become the backdrop for what this might turn into. He ran the available options in under 4 seconds with the cold efficiency that had kept him functional in worse configurations than this, and selected the one that required the most precision and left the smallest footprint. He went back through the supply corridor and found the third man there. The third man heard him at the last possible moment and turned and opened his mouth, and Damien covered the distance before the sound got out. What followed was extremely close quarters and lasted less than 15 seconds, and when it was over, Damien was breathing harder than he wanted to be, and his left ribs, the ones that had caught the elbow last night, were sending up a complaint that was louder than last night's version, and he noted this and put it in the same category as before, which was relevant but not yet determinative. He took the man's radio. The man in the examination room said something into his own radio, 2 words, a check-in, and Damien pressed transmit and said 1 syllable in response, the closest approximation he could manage to the third man's voice register, which was an approximation good enough to buy him roughly 30 seconds before it started sounding wrong. He used 20 of them. When he came through the examination room door, the man at the equipment station reacted fast. Faster than the 2 in the SUV last night, better trained, and the confrontation that resulted was different in character from last night's work, more complicated, more costly. The man by the front door moved to flank, and Damien had to make a decision about sequencing that he made correctly, but not without accepting a consequence. And the consequence arrived in the form of a fist that caught him high on the left cheekbone with enough force to white out his vision for approximately 1 second. 1 second is a long time. He went down to one knee. He came back up before the next blow landed and drove forward instead of back, which was the only viable option from that position, and got inside the man's reach where the longer limbs stopped being an advantage. And from there, it was a matter of endurance and stubbornness, which had historically been Damien's most reliable assets. When it was over, he was standing in the examination room of Nathan Holloway's clinic, with 2 men on the floor and a sound in his left ear that wasn't quite ringing and wasn't quite silence but was somewhere in between, and his cheekbone was doing something that would be extremely visually dramatic in approximately 20 minutes when the swelling found its final position and his ribs had moved from a complaint to a formal grievance. He picked up his phone and called Salvatore. "Clinic's clear," he said. His voice came out slightly rougher than intended. 3 down. I need someone here for containment. On it. A pause. You okay? Functional? That's not what I asked. Send someone, Damien said, and hung up. He stood in the middle of Nathan's clinic for a moment with his hands on his knees and his head down, breathing. Outside, through the front window, he could see Carol still standing on the sidewalk with her phone out, presumably wondering where the utility van was. Beyond her, the main street of Mercy Cove continued its Tuesday. A woman with a stroller, 2 teenagers on bicycles, the bakery closing up. He thought about Elena asleep in the apartment above the hardware store. He thought about 41 years of choices that had led to this specific moment, this specific clinic, this specific set of costs. Then he straightened up and went outside to tell Carol she could go home. By the time he got back to the apartment, it was dusk. Nathan was still in the kitchen, his second cup of coffee long cold, sitting with the patience of a man who has learned not to spend energy on waiting. He looked at Damien's face when he came through the door and said nothing for a moment, which was a significant exercise in restraint given what Damien's face presumably looked like. Clinic? Nathan said finally. Handled. Anyone hurt? Them, Damien said. Carol got some fresh air. Nathan studied the cheekbone with professional attention. Sit down. I don't need... Sit down, son. It was the word son that did it. Not sentimentally. Damien was not in a sentimental place. But the word carried a specific gravity, the weight of being addressed by someone whose respect you hadn't earned and weren't sure you deserved, and were startled to find yourself receiving anyway. He sat down. Nathan examined the cheekbone with careful hands, the same hands that had been managing Elena's care for months. Not broken, he said. You'll look terrible for a week. Noted. Ribs? Sore. Let me... Later. Damien looked at him. Is she still sleeping? I checked 20 minutes ago. Yes. Damien put his forearms on the table and looked at the grain of the wood. His knuckles from last night had cracked open again. He hadn't noticed during the clinic. He noticed now. The blood had dried in the creases of his fingers in a way that looked worse than it was, which was also true of a number of other things in his life currently. You should know, Damien said to the tabletop, that when this is over, and it will be over, I'm going to make sure of that. I'm not going to ask her for anything. I'm not using this as... I'm not collecting a debt. You should know that. Nathan sat back. Why are you telling me? Because you're the person who's been there. You're the one who knows what she's been carrying. He looked up. If I were you, I'd want to know the intentions of the man sitting in my kitchen. Nathan looked at him for a long time. What do you want, Damien? Not what you're telling me you don't want. What do you actually want? The kitchen was quiet. I want to be the father my daughter deserves, Damien said. I want to earn that one thing. And I want Elena to have whatever she decides she wants, even if what she decides is a life that I'm only in the edges of. He paused. That's all I want. Nathan nodded once, slowly, the way men of his generation nod when they've heard something they believe. Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and something in his face changed. Nathan saw it change. What? Damien read the message twice. It was from a federal contact, one of the cooperation channels he'd been maintaining for months, a deputy in the organized crime division who communicated in coded language they'd established early and stuck to rigidly. The message was 3 sentences. It had arrived at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in a coastal town kitchen that smelled like old coffee and someone else's ordinary life, and what it said, translated out of its code, was this. Nadia Caltieri had not gone back to wherever she came from. She had made one call after leaving the building, and that call had been to someone they hadn't identified yet, and 90 minutes later, a vehicle had been flagged on the coastal road 12 miles south of Mercy Cove moving north. Not 4 men. 1. A professional. Independent. The kind of resource that organizations used when they wanted something done in a way that left no organizational fingerprint on it at all. Damien stood up. What? Nathan said again, sharply this time. She hired someone else. Damien was moving to the window, angling to see the street without presenting a profile. Independent contractor. Not her people. Someone clean. How far out? Close. He looked at Nathan. I need you to go upstairs. I need you to be in that room with Elena, and I need you to stay there regardless of what you hear. Damien, Nathan. He turned from the window and looked at the older man directly. Please, go upstairs. Nathan stood. He picked up his medical bag. He looked at Damien with the expression of someone who has very much more to say and has made the decision that this is not the moment for it. Then he went upstairs. Damien stood alone in the kitchen. He took a breath. He looked at the window, at the dark street outside, at the orange pools of the streetlights, and the quiet facades of the buildings he'd spent 3 weeks learning, and the water visible at the end of the main road, black now in the dusk, the horizon where the sky and the ocean made their agreement. He thought about Elena upstairs. He thought about the baby, his daughter, a word that still felt like a foreign language and felt more like his own language every day. He thought about what was coming down that coastal road. Then he turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, he moved to the door and checked the lock and thought about angles and approaches and the specific variables of a street he knew and an opponent he didn't, and the fact that there were people upstairs that nothing on this earth was going to reach tonight. His phone screen glowed briefly in the dark. A second message from the federal contact. Vehicle stopped 2 miles south. Occupant on foot. Damien exhaled through his nose. He checked his watch. He checked the door. He checked the window from the edge. 3 inches of curtain, the street visible in sections. Nothing moved that shouldn't move. The woman with the stroller was long gone. The bakery was dark. A cat moved along the base of the building across the street with the complete indifference of cats to human urgency. Somewhere south of here, someone was walking toward this building in the dark. Someone paid to finish what Nadia Caltieri had started. And Damien Vescari, who had spent 2 weeks being careful and quiet and trying very hard to be something other than what he'd spent 20 years becoming, stood in the dark kitchen of a hardware store apartment in a coastal town and accepted that tonight, one final time, he was going to have to be exactly what he'd spent 2 weeks trying to leave behind. Not because he wanted to be, not because it was who he was choosing to be, but because the door between the past and the future sometimes has to be closed from the inside, from the dark side, by the only person with the right combination of knowledge and ruthlessness to close it completely. And that person was him, and the door was tonight, and on the other side of it were a sleeping woman and an unborn daughter and a retired doctor and the fragile, ordinary piece of a place that had been kind enough to hold them all while the world outside kept being the world. He moved to the back door. He opened it silently. The alley behind the hardware store was dark and cold and smelled of salt air and wet concrete. He stepped into it and let the door close behind him without a sound. And then he heard it. A single footstep from the far end of the alley, precise and deliberate. The footstep of someone who wanted to be heard now because being heard now was the point. Because the point was to move Damien away from the building and into the open and away from the people inside. And it was a good tactic, a clean tactic, the kind that worked on people who let it work. Damien kept his back to the door. He didn't take the bait. "You could have parked closer," he said into the dark. A pause from the far end. Then a voice, male, unhurried, with the flat affect of someone operating without personal investment in the outcome. "Vescari." "Yeah." "Walk away from the building." "No." Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause that means someone is recalculating. "The woman upstairs has nothing to do with my contract." "Then there's no reason for you to be in this alley." "The contract is you." Damien felt something in his chest go very still. Not afraid, past afraid, through the other side of it, into the specific clarity that lives beyond fear when you've been here enough times. "Then come down the alley," he said. "You don't need me to walk anywhere." The silence stretched. The water was audible from here. Waves against the base of the pier, 4 blocks away, the constant percussion of the coast. Somewhere above, behind the closed upstairs window, Nathan Holloway was sitting in a chair beside Elena's bed, with his medical bag on his knees, listening to the sounds of the building, and Elena was either still sleeping or pretending to sleep, which was what she did when she needed to think without being watched. From the far end of the alley, a figure separated from the shadow. Damien watched him come, measured his stride, measured his build, measured the way he held his right side slightly forward, which told him something, and the way his left hand was visible and his right hand was not, which told him something else. He cataloged these things with the speed and precision of long practice and assembled them into the shape of what the next 30 seconds were going to require. And then, from above, from the window directly overhead, Elena's voice came down into the alley, quiet and clear and absolutely steady. "Damien." He didn't look up. "There are two of them," she said. He went cold. The figure in front of him stopped walking, and from the mouth of the alley behind Damien, where the service road met the street, a sound that was unmistakably a second person came out of the dark. And Damien understood, with the absolute clarity of a man who has just run out of acceptable options, that Elena had seen something from the window above that he hadn't seen from the ground, that there had been two vehicles, two approaches, that the federal contact's message had been incomplete or had arrived too late, and that he was now standing between 2 points of a line with nothing behind him but a locked door and nothing in front of him but everything he was not willing to lose, and the next decision he made was going to be the one that determined whether the people upstairs stayed safe or didn't, and he had approximately 4 seconds to make it. He made it. He chose the door. Not away from it, toward it. He spun on the ball of his right foot and went back hard against the door, shoulder into the wood, and instead of fighting the geometry of being between 2 points, he collapsed it, taking away the line by putting the building at his back and the alley in front of him so that both men were now on the same side, which changed the math in the only direction that made collateral exposure manageable. The man from the far end of the alley moved fast. The man from the street entrance moved faster. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean. It was not cinematic. It was the specific, ugly chaos of close-quarters violence in a confined space at night. Elbows and concrete, and the sound of breath getting knocked sideways, and the cold air tasting like salt and adrenaline and copper. Because somewhere in the first 30 seconds, something opened up above his left eye, and the blood reached his eyelid before he could do anything about it, and he fought the rest of it half-blind on the left side, which was not ideal, but was not the worst condition he'd ever operated under. The first man went down at the 40-second mark. The second man was better, not just trained, experienced in the specific way that produces a different kind of problem. Someone who'd been in enough of these to have stopped relying on technique and started relying on patience, who knew how to wait for a mistake and didn't need to manufacture one. He gave Damien space, moved around the edge of the darkness, made Damien come to him. Damien came to him. It was the only move available, and they both knew it, and the second man was ready for it, and it cost Damien in the ribs again. The same ribs, the formal grievance now a full structural crisis. And he felt something give in a way that would require a serious conversation with a medical professional at some point, but not now, not in the next 45 seconds, which was all the time the situation had left in it. He finished it. He stood in the alley afterward with one hand on the wall and his head down and counted his own breaths, the way Nathan had told him to count Elena's. In and out. In and out. The blood from above his eye had reached his chin. His ribs were sending information he was not prepared to act on. His right hand was shaking, which sometimes happened after this kind of thing, and had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with adrenaline doing its accounting. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the wet alley floor with his back against the hardware store door. Above him, the window opened. He heard it. The specific sound of that window, which he'd memorized without intending to, the slight catch in the frame before it gave. And then Elena's voice came down, stripped of everything except the essential. "Are you hurt?" He looked up at her. She was at the window, leaning out slightly, one hand on the frame. Her hair was down. Her face was in shadow, but the light from the room behind her caught the edge of her jaw and the line of her shoulder, and he thought, with the particular clarity that comes after the body has spent everything it had, that he had never seen her clearly enough when he'd had the daily opportunity to do it. "Some," he said. "How bad?" "Ribs, eye, nothing structural." He paused. "Probably." A silence. "Nathan," she said, back into the room. He heard the older man's voice and the sound of the bedroom door, and 30 seconds later the back door of the building opened, and Nathan stepped into the alley with his bag and his robe and the unflappable competence of a man who had made peace a long time ago, with the world being wider and darker than most people allowed themselves to see. Nathan looked at the alley. He looked at the two men on the ground. He looked at Damien against the wall. He crouched down and opened his bag. "This is becoming a pattern," he said. "Yeah," Damien said. Nathan worked with a penlight between his teeth and his hands, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who doesn't waste motion. And what he found in Damien's left side made him exhale once through his nose, so a contained professional exhale, and say, 2 ribs at minimum, possibly 3. You need imaging. Later. Now, Damien. After this is handled. Nathan looked at him. Define handled. I have calls to make. People to bring in for containment. A federal contact who needs to know about tonight. Damien met his eyes. 1 hour. After that, you can put me in whatever machine you want. Nathan studied him for 3 more seconds. Then he taped the ribs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine in circumstances he'd never fully described, closed the cut above Damien's eye with 2 butterfly strips, and helped him stand. Damien made the calls standing in the alley. He made them in the right order, the sequence that would create the cleanest chain of custody and the least exposure for the people he needed to protect. The federal contact first. A conversation of under 4 minutes that covered the night's events with the precision of someone who understood that how you tell a story to the authorities is itself a form of strategy. Then Salvatore, for logistics. Then a lawyer, for the morning, each call short, each one landing its information and closing. When the last call was done, he stood in the alley with his phone in his hand and the night very quiet around him, and let himself feel the full weight of what his body was reporting for approximately 10 seconds. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went upstairs. Elena was not in bed. She was sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment with a glass of water in front of her, and her hands folded on top of her stomach, and her eyes on the door when he came through it. She looked at the butterfly strips and the tape visible at the edge of his shirt, and the way he was holding his left side slightly, and she said nothing for a moment. He sat down across from her. Between them, on the table, was a silence that had the particular texture of 2 people who have run out of things to manage and are now required to simply be in the same room with everything that's happened and everything that hasn't been said. "Is it over?" Elena said finally. "The immediate part, yes." He looked at her. "Nadia Caltieri will be in federal custody by morning. The people tonight were her last play. She's been burning resources for months trying to find leverage, and what she found instead is that every move she made gave the federal case more material." He paused. "She built the case against herself trying to dismantle mine." Elena absorbed this. "And your cooperation, the federal case, what happens to you?" "Reduced exposure, not 0. I'll have obligations for the next 2 years probably. Testimony, documentation." He held her gaze. "I knew that going in." "You could have used Nadia tonight, made a deal." "Yeah. You didn't." "No?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" It was the question underneath all the other questions. He understood that. He'd been understanding it for about 3 months, which was how long it had taken him to find the answer that was actually true, rather than the answer that sounded like the right answer. "Because deals don't end things," he said. "They just defer the cost. And I'm done deferring costs." He looked at the table. "I've been deferring since I was 23 years old. The whole empire was a deferred cost. Our marriage was a deferred cost. Every choice I made that I didn't fully reckon with got added to a balance that I told myself would never come due." He looked up. "It came due." Elena's hands moved slightly on her stomach. That unconscious adjustment, that constant recalibration of comfort and position that he'd been watching her do for weeks. "It almost came due in ways you couldn't have fixed," she said quietly. "I know. Tonight, if you hadn't, I know." "I mean it, Damien." Her voice was even, but her eyes were not, and he registered that the specific quality of emotion that she was not choosing to hide right now, which was different from emotion she was containing, and the difference meant something. "If you hadn't been here, if you'd listened to me when I told you to leave, if you'd actually gone back to your world and closed the door, I couldn't. I know you couldn't." She exhaled. "That's what I'm saying. I know." The apartment was very quiet. Somewhere below them, in the building, a board settled. Outside, the water. "I'm not telling you that changes anything," Elena said. "I need you to understand that. Tonight isn't a door opening. I need to say that clearly, because you deserve clarity from me the same way I deserved it from you, and I never gave it to you very cleanly either." She held his eyes. "I wasn't always honest with you, about how afraid I was, about the things I needed and didn't ask for. I told myself it was strength, but some of it was just, I didn't trust that you'd stay if you saw the actual cost of loving me." He was very still. "I'm not excusing what you did," she said. "I'm just being honest about the whole thing, because I'm tired of only carrying the part that belongs to me and setting down the rest like it's not mine to acknowledge." "Elena, let me finish." She took a breath. "You believed a lie about me because something in you was already afraid it might be true. And something in me let that fear exist in you because I kept the parts of myself that were afraid hidden behind being capable." She looked at him. "We failed each other. You failed bigger, but I failed too." The word failed sat on the table between them. Damien looked at this woman who had survived him and survived the world he'd brought with him, and had sat in a library at 7 months pregnant, negotiating with his enemy with a straight spine and clear eyes, and had leaned out a window in the dark to tell him there were two of them because she was going to make sure he had the information he needed even when the information terrified her. And he thought that he had never in his life been as honest with anyone as he wanted to be with her right now. And he thought about all the years he'd spent mistaking control for strength and fear for wisdom, and what he'd lost in the gap between those two misreadings. "I love you," he said. "I'm not saying it to open a door, I'm saying it because it's true, and I spent 4 years saying it in ways that cost you. And I want to say it once in a way that only costs me." He held her gaze. "That's it. I'm not asking you anything." Elena looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Not tears exactly. Elena didn't do tears easily, hadn't since the first weeks, had spent 8 months building a version of herself that didn't require them. But bright. Present. Looking at him like she was actually seeing him, the specific quality of attention he'd wanted and not earned for a very long time. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He nodded. Nathan knocked on the open kitchen doorway. "Hospital," he said, with the authority of a man who has been patient long enough. "Both of you. Elena for monitoring and Damien for imaging. Now, I've called ahead." They went. The hospital was 40 minutes up the coast, and Damien drove because Nathan's hands had developed a slight tremor in the last hour that the old man was not acknowledging, and Elena sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked because she always needed air when she was in a car, and this had not changed. They didn't talk much on the drive. The road was dark and coastal, and the headlights made a small moving world of light in the surrounding dark, and Damien kept both hands on the wheel and kept his speed steady and watched the road with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the person beside him gets to arrive safely. And that's the whole job right now. That's the only job. At one point, Elena said, "She's moving." "Yeah?" "She does it when I've been still for a while. Reminds me she's there." Damien looked at the road. "Does it hurt?" "No, it's..." Elena paused. "It's like being reminded of something important you almost forgot." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The hospital was quiet at that hour, the organized quiet of an institution managing the night shift, lower staffing, the particular amber calm of corridors where crisis is always possible but not currently present. Nathan spoke to the attending physician with the authority of a retired colleague, and Elena was taken to obstetrics for monitoring, and Damien was taken to radiology with the efficient impersonality of a system that had no interest in his personal history, only in the current state of his left lateral thoracic region. 3 ribs, not 2. The radiologist showed him the imaging with the brisk neutrality of someone delivering a weather report. Damien looked at the images of his own broken architecture and thought about the alley and thought about what those ribs had been doing at the time they broke, which was being positioned between a threat and a building that contained his daughter, and found that the calculus came out the same way it would come out again if he had to run it again. He was taped and medicated and released into the hallway with instructions he would follow approximately half of, which the attending physician seemed to intuit from his expression and repeated with the specific emphasis reserved for patients who understand the information but are not planning to prioritize it. He went to the obstetrics floor. He sat in the waiting area outside the monitoring room with a paper cup of bad coffee and his taped ribs and his butterfly strip eye and waited for someone to tell him that Elena and his daughter were both fine. He sat there for 45 minutes. The waiting area had that specific quality of maternity ward waiting areas, a kind of suspended time, the particular atmospheric pressure of a space where things of enormous consequence are happening behind closed doors, and everyone sitting outside is managing the gap between what they know and what they need to know. At some point, Nathan came and sat beside him. They didn't talk for a while. Nathan had his own paper cup, and they sat in the amber corridor quiet and drank bad coffee and were two men at different ends of their lives who had arrived at the same waiting room for reasons neither of them had anticipated 6 months ago. "She's been taking care of Grace and Thomas too," Nathan said eventually. "You know that. She thinks she's the one being taken in. But she's been taking care of all of us." He turned the cup in his hands. "That's who she is. She finds people and she holds them without making them feel held. It's a talent." He paused. "Don't waste it again." "I know," Damien said. "Knowing and doing are not the same transaction," Nathan said, with the mildness of someone who's had a long time to observe the distance between them. Damien didn't answer. Nathan didn't require one. The doctor came out at 2:47 in the morning and said that Elena and the baby were both stable, blood pressure back within normal range, no signs of early labor, and that Elena was asking for Damien. He went in. She was in the bed with the monitor still attached, the sound of the fetal heartbeat filling the room, that rapid, steady, impossibly competent sound that he had not heard before and that hit him somewhere anatomical, somewhere that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the oldest possible version of what a person is before they've had the chance to complicate it. He stood at the side of the bed and listened to it for a moment. "Strong," the nurse said, adjusting something on the monitor. "Good, strong heartbeat." "Yeah," Damien said. His voice came out lower than he expected. The nurse left. Elena looked at him, at the butterfly strips and the tape and the paper cup he'd forgotten he was still carrying. She reached out, not toward him, toward the paper cup, took it out of his hand, set it on the bedside table. A practical gesture, an Elena gesture, the small, competent management of the unnecessary detail while the larger thing was still present. "Come here," she said. He pulled the chair close. She took his hand. Not a romantic gesture, not the reopening of anything. Just a woman who'd been through an extremely long day taking the hand of someone else who'd been through it with her, and holding on for the simple human reason that holding on was what the moment called for. They sat like that for a while, listening to the heartbeat, while the hospital did its night work around them and the town they'd come from sat quiet on the coast, and the dark water moved against the pier with the indifferent constancy of things that don't require anything from the people nearby. At some point, Elena said, "What will you do after?" "After the federal obligations?" "After everything." He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. Not the performed consideration of someone managing an impression, but the genuine working through of a man who has been asking himself this question for months and has arrived somewhere that is honest, if not entirely resolved. "I have the legitimate businesses," he said. "Some of them are actually viable without the architecture supporting them. Medical supply, a real estate holding company, a logistics operation." He paused. "I've been talking to a hospital foundation about a capital grant, maternal care in underserved coastal areas." He said this last part without emphasis, without directing it toward anything, just putting it on the table as information. Elena's hand didn't move. "There's a woman I used to pay a lot of money to manage my public image," he said. "She told me once that the hardest thing in the world to do is change your actual behavior rather than its appearance, that most people go their whole lives changing the surface and calling it transformation." He looked at his daughter's heartbeat on the monitor screen. "I'm trying to change the behavior." "I know," Elena said. "It's slow." "I know that too." They were quiet for another minute. Then Elena said, "She needs a name." He looked at her. "I've been waiting," Elena said. "I didn't want to. I wanted to wait until it felt like something I was choosing rather than something I was doing alone." She looked at the monitor. I've been calling her something in my head for weeks, but I didn't say it out loud. What? Elena was quiet for a moment. Mara, she said. It means strength. And a little bit, it means bitter. The two things that got me through the year I spent without her father. She looked at him. I think that's honest. Damien looked at the screen. Mara, his daughter's heartbeat, steady and unimpressed with the weight of what was happening in the room around it, doing its simple necessary work. Yeah, he said, it's honest. Grace came back the next morning with Thomas, who walked into Nathan's house and immediately required a complete account of where everyone had been and why his grandfather had called from a hospital and why Aunt Ellie was home from the hospital now and resting when she was supposed to be at the library, and why the man with the hurt face was sitting at the kitchen table again. Thomas studied Damien's face with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned the social function of looking away from interesting things. You have a lot of bandages, Thomas said. Yeah, Damien said. Does it hurt? Some. Thomas considered this. He climbed up into the chair across from Damien with the unselfconscious confidence of a child who has decided a table is for sitting at, and that's reason enough. He looked at Damien with the same thorough attention he'd given everything since Damien had started being a recurring presence in the edges of this kitchen. Are you going to stay? Thomas said. Damien looked at the boy. I don't know yet, he said. That depends on some people who haven't decided. Aunt Ellie? Yes. Thomas absorbed this with the seriousness of a child processing a complex social situation. She's nice, he said eventually, in the tone of someone presenting relevant data. I know, Damien said. You should be nice back, Thomas said, and got down from the chair and went to find his grandfather. Damien sat at the table for a long time after that. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were, if anything, aggressively ordinary. The specific ordinariness that feels extraordinary to someone who has lived outside it for 20 years. Federal interviews. Legal processes. The meticulous and unglamorous work of dissolving a criminal empire through legitimate channels. Paperwork and testimony and the transfer of assets and the careful navigation of a legal framework that was trying to balance accountability with the value of cooperation, which was a balance that pleased no one completely and was therefore, Damien's lawyer told him, probably about right. Nadia Caltieri was indicted on 17 federal counts 2 weeks after the night in the alley. The trial, when it eventually came, would rely substantially on documentation that had been assembled over the preceding 8 months by a man who had decided that the only way to close a door completely was to walk through it and burn it from the other side. Damien testified in closed session. He answered every question with the specific accuracy of someone who understood that partial honesty is a form of dishonesty and that the time for forms of dishonesty was over. He sold the penthouse. He found an apartment 35 minutes from Mercy Cove, not in the town itself. He understood that was not his to claim, but close enough that the drive was not an imposition. A second-floor apartment above an actual business that did actual things, with a parking space and a view of a parking lot and neighbors who nodded in the elevator and knew nothing about him except that he was quiet, and he kept his own space, and he sometimes arrived on Friday afternoons with what appeared to be significant quantities of children's books. He learned the drive. He learned it in all weathers, the coastal road in fog, in rain, in the particular late afternoon gold that made the water look like something manufactured for the purpose of being beautiful. He learned where the speed traps were and where the road narrowed and where you could pull over to watch the waves if you had 20 minutes and a reason to need the water to organize your head. He showed up on Fridays. Every Friday, without exception, weather or legal obligation or the residual complications of a life that was still in the process of being made legitimate, none of it interrupted the Fridays. He showed up and knocked and waited on the porch, and for the first several months Elena answered the door herself, and they stood at that threshold and conducted the handover with the careful courtesy of two people who are being very precise about what they are to each other. He took his daughter to the park. He took her to the waterfront. He took her to Nathan's clinic when she was cutting a tooth, and Nathan managed the situation with his characteristic unhurried competence, while Mara regarded both men with the profound skepticism of a very small person who has opinions about strangers. He learned her preferences, which were strong, clearly inherited, and expressed without ambiguity through a combination of facial expressions and a particular sound she made when something was unacceptable. He learned to braid her hair in the specific way she wanted it, which took 11 attempts and the patient instruction of a YouTube tutorial on a phone propped against a coffee mug, and the 12th attempt was acceptable by Mara's standards, which was as close to praise as the situation offered. He showed up. Every Friday, and then sometimes on Wednesdays when Elena had something she needed, and then sometimes on other days when Mara had something. A birthday party for Thomas, a thing at the library, a first visit to the ocean's edge where Mara stood with her feet at the waterline and looked at the horizon with an expression of complete seriousness, as though the ocean had presented her with a question she intended to fully consider before responding. Damien stood behind her and watched her look at the water and thought about all the things he was going to have to learn to do that he didn't know how to do yet, which was still a very long list, and about the fact that the list didn't frighten him the way it once would have, which was itself a kind of information about how much had changed in how short a time when you actually decided to change, rather than managing the appearance of it. Elena watched from a few feet back. She watched Damien crouch down beside their daughter at the waterline and say something that Mara listened to with her characteristic critical attention, and then responded to with a pointing finger aimed at the horizon, as though she was directing his attention to something he'd been missing. She watched him look where Mara pointed. She watched him nod with the gravity appropriate to the significance of whatever Mara had indicated. She thought about the woman she'd been sitting on a stone curb in the rain with her hands shaking and a secret pressed into her chest. She thought about Mercy Cove and Nathan and Grace and Thomas and the small apartment above the hardware store and the library and the pier and all the ordinary days that had accumulated into a life she hadn't planned and wouldn't trade. She thought about Damien showing up at her door for the first time with nothing but 2 words and the ruins of an empire and a face that had finally learned to carry what it owed. She thought about what forgiveness actually was, which was not, she understood this now, had understood it for a while, the same as restoration. It was not an erasure, and it was not a reopening, and it was not a permission. It was just the release of a weight that you'd been carrying, not because the weight was yours to keep, but because setting it down required trusting that the ground would hold. The ground had held. Not because of Damien, because she had built something on it. Herself first, and then the people around her, and then this small person at the waterline who was currently attempting to have a serious conversation with the ocean. And the ground she'd built on was solid enough to hold the weight of what she'd released and still leave room for what came next. She didn't know what came next. That was the part she'd spent 8 months learning to be all right with. At the waterline, Mara grabbed Damien's finger with both hands, the way she grabbed things she intended to keep. And he let her keep it, and they stood there looking at the water together while the waves did what waves do, and the light did what late afternoon light does on the coast, and the world moved on with its general indifference to the specific weight of the moment. Elena exhaled. She walked to the water's edge and stood beside them. Mara let go of Damien's finger and grabbed Elena's instead, and with her 2 hands occupied, she appeared satisfied that the important inventory of her world was accounted for, and looked back at the ocean with the expression of someone who has been interrupted but is willing to resume. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the water. Not a family the way they'd planned to be, not a story with the ending anyone had written when it started. Something else, harder won, more honestly built, standing on ground that had been tested and had not given way. The water came in and went out. Mara pointed at something on the horizon again. "What does she see?" Damien said quietly. "I don't know," Elena said, "but she sees something." He nodded. He looked at the horizon where Mara was pointing, where the water met the sky in a line that was clean and certain and went on further than any of them could follow. He looked for a long time. The greatest thing Damien Viscari ever built was not the empire that had made men flinch, and governments looked the other way. It was not the network he'd dismantled or the case he'd helped construct or the legitimate businesses he was learning to run like someone who believed in the thing he was doing. It was this. Standing at the water's edge on a Friday afternoon with his daughter pointing at the horizon, and the woman he had failed and not lost holding the other hand, and the ordinary world going on around them in the way that ordinary worlds do, with its bakeries and its library and its retired doctors and its small boys who said, "I think you should name her something nice," and its piers and its birds and its constant, indifferent, necessary water. He had not reclaimed her. He had not deserved to. What he had done was show up and keep showing up and do the right thing when it was expensive and the wrong thing when it was easy, and then do the right thing again and again and again, the way you build anything that lasts, not in one grand gesture, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary choices made honestly over a long time. The water came in. Mara laughed at it, the sudden delighted sound of a small person encountering the ocean's indifference to personal space, and grabbed both their hands tighter, and the three of them stood there at the edge of what had been survived, and what had been built from the surviving, while the sun went where suns go and the water went on being water, and the horizon stayed exactly where it was, clean and distant, and full of whatever Mara had seen in it. Something worth pointing at. Something worth standing still long enough to find. End.